So I'm Kelley Aiken, and I'm a longtime colleague of Alison's, and an artist and a writer. And we originally met in 1999 in Banff, and hit it off, and have been talking about art and art practices ever since. Also teaching together in both in Canada, Europe. This is a kind of reversal interview because Alison interviewed me, I think a year and a half or 2 years ago for her website. And we've worked together since, well, we met in 1999. We've worked together off and on for over 20 years and been in each other's studios. And in latterly, you've been so active online and created these fantastic platforms. And it occurred to me during our interview how why isn't there one about you on your own website? Because I'm sure anyone um, coming to your YouTube page or attending your courses, they can look you up, they can Google you, but you know, I just thought it'd be really fun for us to do an interview where I interview you. So I'm just going to jump in and ask. I had supplied Alison with a number of questions, and I'm just going to refer to those now. You're a self taught artist in large part. When and how did you undertake the study of painting?
Well, I was a biologist and worked as a naturalist when I was in my 20s. And I always drew when I was a kid. I took a lot of art in high school. But then when I was in the real world, I got this job as a naturalist and then decided to study biology. And so every summer, I would go into a park and work there for the summer. And, I kind of became a bit um, entranced by the field sketch art,
Mm-hmm.
uh, this old genre of
Mm-hmm.
what naturalists and biologists do when they're in the field. Before photography, sketching was a big part of being a biologist and especially a naturalist. So I used to keep little sketches when I was working. And so my very first, like the work that I first showed was with other biologists and naturalists, like a group of friends who were all working as naturalists, and we were all doing the same thing. And I really think that there's um, a kind of subset of biologists that are attracted to the field because they love nature. And part of that is an appreciation for the aesthetics of their subjects. So, and a lot of those people who I still am friends with, um, yeah, they used to draw a lot as kids too. So I think it,
Right.
it was a through line for a lot of us. I got a job in a botanical garden as the education director and met a woman who was a British woman who she was actually the daughter of a plant explorer. And she was also a botanical painter. And so she would come to the garden every day, sit down at a drawing table in the corner and draw the collections from the gardens. So I became quite enamored of botanical painting
Right.
and started doing a lot of botanical painting in watercolors. So that was kind of my first medium, my first subjects, serious subjects.
You did train yourself a lot. Now, was that something that you did before you started a family? Obviously, I mean, in terms of the kind of in-depth watercolor, you were self-taught, but how, when did you start to do that in earnest? Or was that
Yeah, yeah.
all?
I think I didn't seek out a lot of instruction. I never actually have. I learned I have learned a lot autodidact, but I also through teaching over the years, but
Oh,
that's another story. Anyway, when I had my children, I was also in the middle of a graduate degree in botany. And I was just overwhelmed. And I kind of thought, okay, I've got three things on in my life. I love to draw and paint. I've got my children, obviously, and I had two children. And I have this graduate degree. And I thought, one of these things has got to go. I don't have time to do, I don't have the mental energy, emotional energy. So I actually left my graduate work, and then I started really concentrating more on keeping and nurturing a painting life, a painting practice. So I went to every resource I could find. And in those days, it was mainly books, or unless you went to a class. I went to a few classes, and I was still really just focused on botanical painting. So, it worked beautifully with my life, because it was very flexible. My husband had a very big, busy job. And that was, I think, another reason why it just like our life couldn't hold these two really intense um, uh, professional practices at that time. So I fit my art in around our life. And then then we moved to Nanaimo. We were living in Vancouver. We moved to Nanaimo, and the local community college, I forget how they found out about me, but they asked me if I would teach botanical painting. And those were my first teaching experiences.
So that was, give me a date on
That would be like 1989, or
that.
well, more than early 90s, when I finally connected up with the college in Nanaimo, which is the university now.
Maybe we could see some of the botanical paintings now.
Sure. Okay, I'm just going to share my screen. There we go. So
Some of these are on your website, or maybe
yeah, they are. I
maybe,
have a botanical gallery on my website because I still teach botanical painting, and
right.
I still love botanical painting, actually. Um, it's not where I spend most of my time in my work, but I love to teach it. And I still do a lot of botanical drawings and paintings in my journals.
Yeah.
So anyway, this is a standalone piece of winter things,
Yeah.
just berries and maple keys and rose hips from where I live on Protection Island in near Nanaimo, Vancouver Island.
And this is painted in, these are both painted in a somewhat classical style in that
Yeah, yeah,
early botanical illustrators always
yeah.
background white for the most part.
Mhm. Yeah, I love that formal genre.
Yeah.
Then when you start to build in backgrounds and different kinds of, loosening your focus in places, kind of starts to merge more into what I would call florals. Although botanical painting has had a real renaissance in the last 30 years.
Yeah.
There's people doing it all kinds of ways. But I mean, the critical part of botanical painting is that you must be able to identify the subject. I mean, that's what the purpose of botanical painting was originally, before photography. And it was really important during the age of exploration, when all the plant material was flooding in from all over the world into places like Kew.
Yeah.
And they had to have full-time botanical artists on staff to document the stuff as it was coming in. So my botanical painting mentor at Van Dusen Gardens, where I worked in Vancouver, always, I did learn a lot from her when I worked there. She said, the botanical painting you must be able to, it must be representative of the genus, the species, the cultivar, whatever it is you're painting. It has to be a representative example of the plant, and the plant has to be in good form. Now it's, botanical painting has really kind of broken wide open, and people are painting things in decay and just a single cone, or it's fabulous. I absolutely love it, but everything is still very recognizable. So these are Lenten roses from my garden, and yeah, they're on that classic white background. They look quite like, it is kind of a flat medium, although you can build depth in the narrow plane of the painting. So that's what a lot of the skill of botanical painting is, how you create the sense of depth in such a narrow field of view. So yeah, I still love this form. but I don't often sit down with my tiny, tiny brushes and do that anymore.
Yeah. This and the date on this would be
So this would be probably I don't know, like 2000, the 2000 aughts,
okay.
2005, 2006. And so this is an example of, this isn't exactly a formal botanical, right? But I just thought I applied the skills of the botanical painter to this portrait. It's a still life, really, of figs with
I love it. I
tissue
love it.
paper.
This and I remember seeing this. This also is on your website, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. It's on that botanical gallery. Okay, so let's go back to that because we may want to talk a little bit more about this part of my life or this subject material, or how do you feel?
I'm sure, absolutely. So at this point, you're still working primarily in watercolor. Have you started to do any stuff in acrylic at this stage?
No, no, not really. What I was what I was doing was I started teaching regularly, and but I did want to expand my media and my subject material. So I was teaching watercolor, botanical painting regularly. And so I started to experiment with acrylic. And unfortunately, I don't have any of those early acrylic pieces. But, and you know, my students would come from my classes and they'd see these acrylic pieces. By this time, I was teaching in my studio on Protection Island. And they said, could you teach us how to do that? So, and that's kind of how it's been through my whole teaching life, which is now like, this is like 30 years later.
Yeah.
Um, you know, I kind of keep just one step ahead. And sometimes it feels like of the students, and really just I'm just feel like I'm sharing my journey with them, and I learn a lot from that.
Your technical mastery in watercolor is it's fantastic. Did you feel that it was an easy? I'm kind of going off script. I had provided you just for the audience. I had provided Alison with a set of questions, but as we look at the paintings, more things are kind of coming up for me. And
Huh. Yeah,
when
that
you,
makes sense. Let's
yeah,
make it organic. Yeah.
yeah, when you transitioned or you started to work in acrylic alongside, did you feel that you had to like this is a question I think that comes up for a lot of people when they're figuring out new mediums. Like was it a simple enough progression from watercolor to acrylic?
No, it was actually it took a long time, actually, several years. And partly because I just found the acrylic so sticky. And also it was a new experience, like with an opaque medium like oil or acrylic. As you know, you have to mix every tone. So, you know, with watercolor, you can make a
It's all
transition, you know,
yeah,
from here to here in one stroke,
yeah,
just by varying the amount of pigment in the water and, you know, the way you do the stroke. And you can have a whole value range
yeah.
or tonal range in one stroke. And I actually found that really, really frustrating and very like arduous, you know. Um, so I actually then somebody said, well, why don't you use some medium, like a glazing medium, with add it to the acrylic paint. I had worked a little bit with oil.
Yeah.
Um, anyway, that made the acrylic paint more creamy, and then it
Mm-hmm.
felt more easier to work with. And so anyway, that transition took quite a long time for me before I sort of had the pieces of craft so I could start to make the paint do what I wanted it to do. And now, I mean, we can talk about this later as we go through the work too. Um, I find myself going back to some of the techniques of watercolor, like using a lot of really thin glazes and, you know, using the paint with water and building up, you know, these transparent layers. So it's interesting, you know.
Yeah, and I think I associate that with your work. I think I associate that sense of transparency, the brilliance of color, the layering, the atmospheric quality that you get with acrylic. The that you're. I mean, I've learned a lot from your technique because of that thing that where you build that original surface a lot and then bring in, which is for the most part transparent or translucent, and then you'll bring in these opaque periods. So let's move on to some more images, even if it keeps us in watercolor. I mean, I think you need to mention a little bit about what this is. This particular image from your book?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when I was in my early 20s, I worked as a research assistant for a young French Canadian woman on a very remote island off the coast of British Columbia. And it's a huge seabird breeding colony.
Triangle.
And, pardon?
Triangle Island.
Triangle Island, yeah. And her name was Anne Valet. So I worked a whole season there with her. And 2 years after we worked together, she fell and died on the island. And the island is now called the Anne Valet Ecological Reserve.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's still on the charts. It's still Triangle Island. But I went back to Triangle Island when I was 39, I think. And because I had always wanted to return. And in those intervening years, I'd been working a lot as a eco tour guide on sailboats on the coast of British Columbia and had developed a knowledge base of the outer coast and the natural history of the coast, beyond the natural history of Triangle Island. And I wanted to bring the story of the island and Anne and the story of the outer coast together. So I set out to write this book, and it became The Last Island. Sorry, I just forgot the name of my book. It was published in 2001. It was a while ago. The Last Island, a Naturalist's Sojourn on Triangle Island. So I really wanted to illustrate it, and I did encounter some resistance from the publishing industry because we don't have a lot of hand illustrated books for adults. We didn't then. Maybe there's more now. But anyway, I had the great pleasure of illustrating the book myself. So this is a common myrrh on its egg, this beautiful little turquoise egg. And they nest on absolutely sheer cliffs, and then they lay their eggs on tiny ledges. And anyway, that was Triangle Island. And I don't usually paint wildlife, but a couple of years ago. No, this is with acrylic.
I'm just going to get you to move the arrow off the body of the head.
Sorry. My arrow is expanded too, because when I teach online, I expand.
Oh, yeah.
I haven't changed it to a small arrow. Anyway, I just, I love birds. And so a couple of years ago, I did a whole series of birds on these
What
little.
size were these, Alison?
These are like 8x8, 6x6. They just were so fun to do. It was like spending time with good friends. All these birds of the West Coast, the red-breasted nuthatch. I'm not sure if I've gotten
that was acrylic on panel.
This is acrylic on a wood panel.
Yeah.
And the panel is gessoed black. Yeah. So it has, creates this kind of linear feel.
Okay, so that what we see peeking through is the gesso layer.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so I did a whole series of those and really enjoyed that. But I'm not usually a bird painter.
So that series that you produced, was it something that you showed at that time?
No, I might have showed a few of them. I had a small works show in my studio here. They just friends bought them. I gave some to family. Yeah. They were just such a joy to paint.
I think it might be good to just describe a little bit about how you work and where you work, because you have quite a beautiful setup in your backyard. You have another building that is your studio.
I have a studio in my back garden, and I didn't include any pictures of it, but you can go to my YouTube channel. It's just Alison Watt. Just go to YouTube, Alison Watt. And there's a video that I put up recently that I made for the show that I'm having with these naturalists who I showed with first 40 years ago at the Center for the Sailor Sea in in Sydney on Vancouver Island. We're having a show which opens on February 22nd. And I made a kind of introductory, a very short video about where I live, what my studio looks like, and what I'm painting these days. So you might want to just check in with that. It's just about 4 minutes long. See pictures of my studio. I think there might be some on my website too. So that was where I was teaching for many, many years in my studio. But things have shifted, and we can talk about that now or later, whenever you like.
And this is this yours or is this one of your students?
So I put this in because I wanted to talk about my teaching practice.
Okay.
And so this is a drawing. I gave a drawing nature class. So I still occasionally, go back and teach those from those roots of drawing in the field. And I just, I love working with students, and I liked this exercise because it was very simple, just, one color and then the white gouache. Yeah. And so, yeah, it's it's just a pleasure to work with students with this material. This is another drawing from the class.
Sorry, yours or a student's?
It's a student's. And, in those days, this was a while ago, I didn't label my slides with the student's name. So unfortunately, I can't say who.
I have a lot of that on.
Yeah. I keep a lot of bits and pieces in my studio, bones and shells and dry plants and things like that for these classes. And we're, basically working with creating a good drawing. And
they're very sensitive. They're lovely. They all have
values. Yeah, I love the studies on the tinted paper. That's on tinted pastel paper and mouton paper, and you can get them in all these beautiful earthy colors. So that was a lot of fun. And then I still draw nature a lot in my journals. So although it's not part of my studio practice so much, except when I'm teaching, I journal a lot, whenever especially when I'm out sailing or, working with students with guests on these eco tours that I lead from time to time. Sometimes they're art based. And then, with you, Kelley, when we're teaching together in France or in Canada, sometimes we do nature studies. So the journal is a big part of my sketching practice.
You've over the years produced, I would say, filled how many journals by now?
Oh, just, I don't know, like 20 or 30.
At least a dozen, yeah?
Yeah, 20 or 30. They're in my studio. And I've tried every kind of journal that you can buy and made my own journals too.
And I have one of those. So this is from the Galapagos. That's actually something when we met, we both realized that we had spent time in Latin America, and that was part of why we were kind of interested in each other right off the bat. Both of us working with Edna Alford in 1999 at Banff. This is another one that's from one of your journals that you were a guide in the Galapagos at a couple of times, weren't you?
2 or 3 times I guided for Hidden Adventures, in a Canadian company. Yeah.
Fantastic. And the notion of adding script, all of this, you've taught the art of the illustrated journal out of your studio in Nanaimo. And is that something that you've continued to do?
I teach online now.
Yeah. But so, I mean, do you still teach this subject?
I still teach illustrated journal. Yeah. And last year I built that into a course called A Sense of Place.
Oh, right.
And actually, Kelley and I took that format to Tofino on the west coast of Vancouver Island last spring to test that out. And it worked really well. It was really fun. So we made these concertina books, and we generated a whole bunch of images in a whole bunch of different ways. and then curated the images into these concertina books. So you bring back from the experience kind of finished book of the experience. And a lot of it was nature studies. And the script is something that we encourage students to, explore and integrate into the journal format. Yeah, I love script. I'm not very good at it. I'm not like a calligrapher. I really admire calligraphy, but I just do my own kind of script. But I do also like kind of hunting scripts. Like when we're doing workshops, sometimes we'll encourage our students to hunt for fonts and see if they can integrate them into their pages.
That's yeah, terrific. In something like this, like I think it would be interesting for others. I know it is for me. Like, how long would a sketch like this take?
This one was really, really quick. And this was on one of the journal types that I've worked in the past that's got very, it's just like a cartridge paper.
Yeah.
It's not a watercolor paper. So you can't actually do a lot of building up of layers. It'll take maybe 2 layers of paint, and then that's it. And then the paper just starts to fall apart. Yeah. So I actually really love those. Those are those big black ones, you can get them in different sizes, but they and different brands too. But anyway, the paper is not that.
It's pulp paper. I mean, most of the sketchbooks we buy now are pulp paper, although occasionally you can get rag content. But I love the effect, and you're right, it's a thin effect because you can only layer a couple times. But there's a crispness to the edge of the washes, which is, I mean, it really is worthwhile for people when they're doing painting, and this is something that you and I both teach, to experiment with different surfaces, because sometimes something that's really inexpensive gives you this sort of unique overall feeling.
So this sketch probably took me about, I don't know, 10 minutes.
Wow.
In fact, I was trying to show the students how you can, build your frame and just get a drawing in very quickly and just put a few layers in. But because this paper you can't layer it up and build the sense of volume and depth with watercolor, it lends itself to some line work. So the line is carrying part of the burden of, resolving the image. So that's kind of fun too. So I usually would do pencil, then a little bit of watercolor, and then just pull out a few places that might use a little bit of line with a fine permanent pen.
And that tends to be the order that you work in, is pencil, wash.
On that kind of paper, yeah. So usually I don't add a lot of pen to my little watercolor sketches, because if the watercolor is doing the work, if you're able to work on a paper where you can work in layers and kind of model with watercolor the depth, then you don't actually need pen. They can kind of fight against each other, right? Do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, it'll flatten, a line around a form will flatten it. But in a case like this, it's funny. It's a bit paradoxical. Sometimes this just enlivens the image, because you get that the paper is weirdly absorbent, and also doesn't, as you said, doesn't take a lot of layering. So you go to a medium value a lot. So the line really kind of crisps things.
And it creates contrast. So you've got some places where there's sharp edges and some places where there's softer edges. But it's fast. I really like that, working on that paper in a way, because it's so fast. You have to have a really light touch. So these are just some, I think I just threw in some sketches that I've done, quickly on when I travel.
Yeah. And this is typical for your journaling. You'll have a lot of the faster ones, and then every once in a while you'll sit down for.
Yeah, right. Right. If I'm really trying to keep a diligent studio practice, in other words, or a journal practice, a journal a day, I think these are from a time when I was doing that a lot. Just try to I think I drew this even without a pencil line, just to start. And so you just draw quickly and you can't fuss over the image. So these are just, sampling from my journals and
yeah. Do you have any aspirations or desire to do another book like The Last Island, where you have text
I would love to do an illustrated book, but
along with all the million other things you're doing?
yeah, but like you know, we're also creative writers,
Yeah.
and I'm also a creative writer, and I'm only really interested in writing a story, you know, and this and in the sense of having a narrative that holds the images together in a really compelling way. You know, at one point I wanted to do a book about the Gulf Islands where I live,
Yeah.
and each one is a little different, and they're just full of wonderful things to draw and paint, and it would make a kind of good collection. But I couldn't find the through line of narrative because I would want there to be some, you know, some story that held them together. And The Last Island was kind of a gift, you know, it kind of knit itself together through a combination of the initial event of me being there when I was young, and then Anne dying, and then the return, and then some things that happened that summer that kind of created a really, I
Story.
think, a really good, compelling narrative. So I just haven't quite found that story yet. But I mean, you and I have talked about doing a book, more of a manual instruction, because between the two of us, we have a lot of experience in a lot of different media, and we've taught together. And so maybe that will happen someday.
I think
Who
like
knows? Big chunk of time.
yeah.
So just I sail every summer with my husband, and so a lot of my sketches in the summer are when we're sailing. This painting was from a summer when I was trying to work, you know, with a lot of earth tones and in very, very simple, like not a lot of detail, just
Love it.
chunks
Yeah.
of color. So as Kelley mentioned, we've taught together. This is sketching in France. How many years have we been doing that, Kelley? 9 years?
Well, last year was our ninth year, but we had a gap of two, was it 2 full years that we didn't do it? We didn't do it in 2021 or 22. So we had a 3 year hiatus because of COVID.
Yeah.
But this is from one of our trips to Paris. This is the, what is the cemetery called?
Père Lachaise.
Yeah, Père Lachaise. And I also have an image that's another statue, not this one, quite close to Alison and I were sitting pretty close to one another. I think facing in slightly different directions, painting. Yeah, this is fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, this is the very best way to be in a city, especially a city like Paris, and I've been there lots of times, is drawing and painting because you're really there. You know, you sit and you spend real time in a place. You might not go to as many places as you would,
Mm-hmm.
but you know, if you were just on your own and just touring, trying to hit all the sites. But we spend really quality time when you sit down and paint. It's really fabulous. And actually, we're planning to go next summer to do a journal course in Paris again, a week in Paris.
No, and I think that's a really important point. I think that something about sitting in a space and drawing. For one thing, you look more deeply than you would if you were passing through or taking a photograph. Sometimes photography replaces observation, but um, it feels like, and I think you experienced this many times with your journal sketching, you're not just deeply observing, which is a pretty significant thing. You're absorbing that whole sensual experience.
Everything.
You stop
Yeah,
and hear it and smell it.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, so you have that experience in real time, and then you have the images afterwards to re-evoke those sensations. Yeah, it's really fun. This is our group in Lyon that Kelley and I taught last summer.
That was fun. Trip.
Yeah, it was a great trip. These are just some more very quick little vignettes, also from Lyon. Um, this is a place that I was with my family last summer, last
So
fall.
this is just before we met in Lyon.
Yeah, yeah. This is in Beaufort, tiny little village called Beaufort, not far from Toulouse. And a gorgeous town near the village of Espediac, where we've taught for many years in the Lot in southwest France, and a beautiful historic village called Saint-Cirque-la-Papie.
Yeah, these are terrific. I think that 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 thing of being in a space and creating, in a sense, your journal becomes a narrative of the trip, and it just seems, looking at your work as well as remembering the pieces that I did at the time, it just brings the memories flooding back. It's fantastic.
Yeah, that was a great afternoon.
Yeah.
What a kind of quiet terrace where nobody else was. It was a very hot afternoon, and we could draw in the shade, and it was really, really fun.
Sorry, go on to the next one. I just.
Yeah. So this sort of relates more to that transition from watercolor to acrylic, and maybe even more like some of the things that I'm working with now in acrylic, the layering and texturing, abstraction.
Is this something that's come out of, is it a parallel thing where it was something you wanted to explore and you started teaching, or did it come out of teaching? And I find when I'm teaching, I'm looking through Pinterest a lot to see how other artists work. So tell me a little bit about how you arrive at this technique or this layering.
Yeah, I think now I can't remember exactly how this particular combination of techniques, what the precursors to that were, but I became really, really fascinated with transferring. So
Okay.
this one kind of, I think I discovered this one technique, and then started experimenting with it to create surface and like different kinds of line, right? So ways of creating line that aren't using a tool like a pen or a paintbrush. And in fact, that's kind of one of the directions that I then went further. This is about 8 years old. I went further with, and that's really a big focus of how I work now, is to not use a brush, using a whole bunch of other ways of getting the paint on the surface before I start picking up brushes and working more with more intent, with the hand and the brush. So this is a transfer of paint from wax paper. So you put the paint on, roll the paint on the wax paper, create some pattern with it, and then press it, transfer it like a monoprint onto your surface. And then painting out with opaques to find form. And that's still a big focus of mine, both in the courses I teach and the work I do too. But I love the distressed surface that you get from that, and this, the sense of taking control away to create surprises. That's a big part of how I work now.
So it's a combination of printmaking and painting. Actually, it
That
uses printmaking techniques.
Yeah, but I also use other ways of getting surface down.
Okay.
So printing from stencils or printing from textured materials, or the transferring is just one of the ways, or pulling scraping paint across a surface with a credit card or a silicone tool or something like that. Yeah.
And people, as we go through talking about these images, a lot of the techniques that you're describing are parts of the courses that you teach, right? And there are videos on your website.
Yeah, they are. And taking different subjects and moving them into abstraction, partly through use of applying texture, creating surfaces through interesting tools and techniques.
And just getting more complex. It also helps. Just as a fellow artist, what you end up with is this complexity of surface, this more atmospheric kind of stuff, and the sense of there being depth as well. Because acrylics sometimes can be quite flat. And I
Exactly.
feel like you're adding this lovely other dimension that has always been a part of watercolor, where you have the sense of depth. You can have the
Exactly.
transparency, but here you have it again with that textural.
Yeah, that's been the motivator for me, is to like pull some kind of surface out of acrylic. So what it's best at is drying fast, right? And
Mm-hmm.
that's the advantage of it. So you can build up all these layers
Yeah,
quickly.
right.
And yeah, and create these surprises if you let yourself, use these wild techniques
Yeah.
and tools. And there's something else I was going to say with that, but yeah, just building up these really rich surfaces to create some kind of sense of presence of the paper,
Mm-hmm.
of the paint, and to like unflatten acrylic. Yeah. Um, I'm not exactly sure why I threw this in, maybe to show how these techniques are influencing my watercolors too.
Yeah.
So I still work with watercolor. And in fact, you and I gave a course a few years ago on water media called Just Add Water. And so, we were trying to work outside of the traditional form of watercolor. I think that's why I generated this, using a lot of resist and glazing, um, overdrawing with ink. And I like to draw with twigs, and uh, not sure I used twigs in this one or not. I think I did, actually. Some of these dark black lines were drawn with twigs. And this is an example of one of these surfaces built up with, all these different tools and techniques, including glazing, like watercolor, like using these really thin glazes to, create depth through layers of glazing. So this
And
is,
also this sense of you and I have spoken recently about very interested in water, and I know there's a number of images in the collection that you're sharing today.
yeah, I am very focused on water. I guess because I live in a watery environment.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah. Um, so this was a tide pool. This is from a class. So all the students did this. Again, you can see the transferred line
Mm-hmm.
from the wax
Absolutely.
paper. And that's where you put the black paint on the paper, on the wax paper, put it face down on the surface, and then draw into it. So you're actually scratching the paint onto the paper. Or you can draw into it before you press it down, but then you get a negative line rather
Yeah.
than a positive line.
Like Barry's over on the right side.
Like here, yeah, like here. Yeah. So and this is the kind of you know, surfaces that I'm working with in abstraction with acrylics. Again, that had a black underpainting, kind of reads like maybe an abstracted flower or not. So one of the processes that I like to work through is just pure abstraction, like starting with a surface and just responding to it. So an intuitive painting process, which is something that I teach and talk about as well. And because I think that building up intuitive skills helps no matter what genre you paint in, even if you're painting in representational styles. Intuitive painting teaches us to slow down and respond to our painting at each step. And uh, it,
And not have that preconceived end result.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And it's a real pleasure. Like it's when I started working in this way and became comfortable with it, it took a while to become comfortable with it, because you can't sort of say, okay, I'm going to do this, and you're going to do this, and this, and then that's going to bring me to the completion of the work. It's more like, I'm going to do this. I'm sure you've
And then see
experienced
what
this too,
next.
Kelley. I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to stop and think about it. And then I'm going to decide what the next step is. And so, I think this is like one of the best practices any painter can develop, because every painting is an abstraction, right? Because we're trying to put the three-dimensional world in two dimensions. And so even a representational painting develops its needs as it goes, as you work through it. And you have to be alert and responsive to those in order, I think, really, really believe this so strongly, to make the best work. And once you can relax into that, it makes painting so much more fun because you're not carrying all this anxiety about how you're going to finish it.
Right. Or whether it's going to look like the thing.
Yeah, exactly. Well, this is one, again, if it's abstracting plants and working with building surface. This is from, I usually do every year before my kind of fundamentals course called Serious Fun. I do a few free classes called Playdates. And this was a couple of years ago. We were working with sunflowers and, building surface and painting out and using collage and trying to find the thing. If you build up these very rich surfaces, then, eventually you have to find some form, or it's just, it's a surface design, like a fabric, or so, there's techniques that I taught in the course on how to simplify and like reintroduce the recognizable form of that you started with without, going into real representational painting. And I think just in a way of sampling a bunch of different techniques. Yeah. And so I did a whole series of those based on sunflowers. And that course is actually available on my website as a self-directed course. So this is just part of the series. Actually, that was the first one, same as the first one. And my Playdates this year was based on creating a surface and then painting it out to find form using negative painting. So part of it started with palettes, like using your basic color choices, creating all your mixes to explore a limited palette fully. And this is also very important, like rather than reaching for every pure hue you've got in your paint box, just choosing a few and then mixing all the secondaries, the neutrals, making desaturated versions of your hues, mixing them back into each other, finding everything that palette can do. And then sort of the bonus exercise was go and hunt a palette. This is so much fun. I mean, I've done it before, but I took it from this bittern, and I just loved the colors in the bittern. So I created a palette around that. And this was for my demos, the demo videos for the free Playdate sessions. And so this was one of the surfaces that I made from that. Doesn't look like you pull those colors out of that bird, but those were the colors mixed back in and then applied onto the surface in lots of different ways with, textured wallpaper and transferring of paint and mark making and glazing and resist. So we made these very, very textured surfaces and then, painted them out. And I wouldn't necessarily have needed to paint the bird again. You could paint anything, find a form by painting around it, whatever you want. But I did love the bird, so I just decided for fun to do the painted out bird. And then these are big pieces of collage. So we talked about visual language and, working back into the painted out form to create connection again between the background and the object that you've created by painting out around it. So this course also is available on my website as a self-directed course called Rich Surfaces, Strong Images. So that was fun.
How does the teaching of these courses influence the way you work in your own practice?
Oh, just hugely. Like, this is my main instructor, is developing each course forces me to explore, like go into Pinterest or have a look at what other artists are doing, create a set of skills and techniques, and really just ahead, like a wave ahead of the course often. And then of course I'm integrating those techniques into my own work too. But teaching is my main instructor. Kelley, you did a formal degree in art. That was your degree. But I did some art in university, but it was not my study. So I kind of, it's my habit to teach myself. Although I do think that and I've learned a lot from you too, actually, over the years. We have an exchange of
sure.
Knowledge and techniques, experience. But I think that I'm kind of thinking about where I'm going to find some instruction. So it's time for me to go out and find some formal instruction. I think it's really important. And sometimes I don't make the time for that, but because I'm so busy with developing my own courses and trying to get into my studio to do my own painting. So it's the piece that's easy to ignore, but I think that I need to look for just the right instructor or mentor soon.
We're both writer painters, and I know that definitely with The Last Island, you had this really lovely kind of coming together of the writing part of you and the painting, drawing part of you. As you work, do you feel that the things that interest you in terms of imagery and composition and subject matter in painting, does that also translate over to your writing?
To my writing?
Yeah.
Not very much. They really are kind of like in separate rooms in my brain, although maybe they do seep through, because in the years when I was writing a lot of poetry is when I started doing a lot of abstract painting.
Wow. So, do you think of poetry as the more abstract of the writing medium?
I do, because it breaks language apart and makes space, and someone else pointed that out to me, and I thought that was really interesting. In those years, I was painting almost pure abstract. Yeah. I think now I'm mostly exploring natural imagery, even in some of my sort of more abstract pieces. So nature, and the things that I wrote about in the Last Island, that sort of well of interest and passion for nature still comes out in my painting. And in my novel, there was a big component in my novel, Dazzle Patterns, about painting.
Yeah.
And it was fun because I was able to create a character that was an art instructor, and say some of the things that I say in my teaching practice through this painter, and the things that I know that teachers were teaching at that time in the early 1900s that haven't changed, the fundamentals. But I don't actually have a lot of more concrete connections between writing and painting. Do you see any that I'm not seeing?
I don't know. I find that there are times when I know in my own practice, there are times, because I've really only written poetry in the last 10 years. I haven't written prose that much. And there are times when I would be quite interested, and I think you're very interested in this too, about the way that we arrived at something and the kinds of these sort of states that you enter when you're in a studio, and that I wanted to write about it, and poetry seemed to be the right form for that. I'm not sure how successful they were as poems, but and maybe that's ekphrasis, like one art form commenting on another. But I don't know if that's something you've done overtly, other than what you're describing about the character in your novel. You do write a lot about the natural world, and you draw your imagery from the natural world, even when you're working in abstraction.
I think the fact is that it comes from the same pool of passion and emotion, and then is expressed in different ways. The interesting thing about being a painter and a writer, though, and I did a talk about this at the gallery in Nanaimo a couple of years ago, which is why I was forced to sit down and think it through. But language has a much narrower range of interpretation. Poetry accepted, like that, and that's why I think there's a lot of painters who are poets.
Yeah.
Painting has way more potential for impression. Like a viewer can go to a painting and see something very, personal, and 100 viewers will have a different response, find different content in that painting, depending on what kind of painting it is. But language, if we break language apart too much, if we abstract it, there's no comprehension at all. And I think poetry is trying to do what painting does. And that's just like strip away some of that specificity. So there's more room for, the reader to kind of slip into the areas where that we don't express in language, which is what painting is, right? It's like what we can't express in language. So just an observation.
No, it's a really interesting one. And I mean, often you and I will have conversations that then kind of branch out into, other things. And I'm kind of feeling this here right now, because when I think of, I mean, if someone sits down to read a novel, yes, the writing restricts us to that storyline, that plot, that setting, but everybody has a different movie in their head when they're reading a book. I mean, my movie from reading any, say, Jane Eyre would be different. My attic, the attic that I see
with the mad woman
flames, all of that would be different from what you see. But I think also that there's a way in which that narrative focus, for me, it's definitely a part of the painting process. Like there's sometimes that inner image, which is like the movie that you get when you're reading a book, and then you try to capture it, but forget it, it goes away, and you have to kind of let it slip away while you find the other thing that's coming out of your paint or your drawing. And I mean, I'm not saying that that's everybody's process all the time at all, but is narrative a part of your painting process? I guess that's what I'm asking. Is narrative a part of your
Okay, that's an interesting question. I just want to put it, say, an aside for the viewers that, as you can see, Kelley and I have a lot of like fertile areas where
Right, this is not a normal interview. That's
we can
okay.
talk for hours, and we live in very different cities. She lives in Toronto. I live very far away on Vancouver Island.
Although I'm in LA right now.
Yeah. One time we were driving towards where we were going to be teaching in France, and we picked up a car like an hour and a half north, and we missed our turnoff. Broke an hour before we realized we'd missed our turnoff. And because we were so deep in conversation. Anyway, back to narrative.
Yes.
How I like to work now is to find the narrative as I go.
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of what really excites me. So not to approach the painting with intent, but
let's look at some of the water-based paintings then. I really want to, because I think there's a lot of narrative kind of, sorry, I'm going to get you to skip past some of these things.
Yeah,
we
okay.
Turn to them.
Okay, let me just, I'll just skip past these. I was just going to talk about still life.
Which I want you to, but well, this might be this might be a 2 or 3 part interview, because we have to do that with me too. Yeah. But yeah. I love these water images, and they're very evocative, and they're also the atmospheres you're making, capturing, have a kind of built-in narrative to me. There's some like I will get a certain set of feelings from this that are a little bit about entering into this space, entering into this landscape, waterscape.
Yeah, well, I mean,
your turn.
Yeah, I started with an image on this, and it's a very big painting. It's 4 by 5, I think, and was a photographic image. I don't really like working from photographs, but I always put them aside when I'm after I start the image, because again, that importance of the intuitive process. And so this one I did kind of know where I was going, although I have to say there's another painting underneath this that was completely different and really just awful. That was more like just big blocks of pattern, and I was trying to that was an example where I was trying to create a narrative as I went, trying to find catching some direction to go. Whereas this one, so then I just thought, this isn't working, and I painted over it. And I started with this starter image, but then I put it aside so I could work, responding to what the space seemed to need. So, but I am really, this is bringing in these kind of watercolor techniques of
very much
glazing and glazing and glazing, and the combination of the opacity and transparency. And actually, one of the things, and maybe this could be, you could call this a narrative that developed in this series, was this idea of when you look at a body of water, especially something that's like surrounded with like very closely interdigitated with vegetation. You have the like what you can see through the water. You can see what's coming up through the water. You can see what's sitting on the water.
And what's around.
What's reflected on the surface. And that I just found so wildly wonderful. Like and it made me, now I look at water totally differently. It's like, and when you paint, you have to build these layers. And it was like I absolutely discovered the layering in that, in a marsh, and all the different, things that are visually hitting us with water. Now this is a different landscape, a drier landscape, but it's got, I guess the seascape is watery, but I wanted to, there's another landscape that's dominated with water, and this one is built through a very experimental process. It started with making collage papers and then interacting with glazing and mark making with opaque materials like oil pastel, and using collage papers to create these great, surfaces that are kind of hard to create just with the brush, because the collage, because you can rip it and put it in different ways. So there's again this element of surprise and the unexpected. Let's see if I can find some more of those water papers. This water paintings, again, this is like this experimental technique where actually this is an example of finding the narrative as I went. I just put the paint down on the surface and then see what comes out, and then build a landscape with the collage materials I have on hand, and then glazing and then overdrawing and just, playing. Here's another one in that series.
Well, I think one of the things about landscape, and I'm finding this with your work quite a bit, that I don't think we'll ever stop having landscape as a subject matter in the world of art, because there's something so there. It's, in a way, these landscapes don't exist, even though we sometimes start with, you're inspired by certain environments that you lived in or that you traveled through. But for the viewer, for me, looking at your painting, I go into the painting, and I think with still life, we're often looking at something, or
true.
With portraiture, you're relating to the personality. With landscape, we kind of go in, like a successful landscape is also a dreamscape for people where they enter into it, and then they build a narrative by being in that space, by entering that space.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. This one, again, was built mainly through experimental techniques and with a very limited palette and with some masks. But the interesting thing is, when I work with these experimental techniques, quite often what evolves is it's not a specific place, but it's a place I know. Like these are the colors of the Okanagan, the interior of British Columbia. It's kind of very dry and desertic. And it's other than the coast, it's the part of Vancouver, of British Columbia, that I love the best. And in fact, the person who bought this said, that's where I grew up, in the Okanagan. So it's interesting how that happens. And here's another one that I did, just, not working from a photograph, just working with different tools and techniques for getting the paint down, again, like using some masks and a lot of glazing. And this is a coastal landscape, and it's so much like the landscape where I live, these layers. There's islands, big bodies of water, the inland sea, the Sailor Sea where I live, and then off in the distance, these layers of receding landscape. So it still comes through. And this one also I built with this experimental approach. I finished it, of a video of starting this on my YouTube channel. I finished it and I realized this is a place I go to every summer, Middle Natch Island. It's the palette of Middle Natch Island. It's the view. It's not exactly the view, but it's the place. It's there. And I find that a really interesting process. So that's kind of how I like to do landscape these days. It's kind of non-specific, just see what happens. And again, another painting where I was just experimenting with layering and glazing, and it's the Strait of Georgia, or the Sailor, otherwise known as the Sailor Sea. This is just like the view from one of the islands that I visit often, where you get these shallow tide pools where you can see through the tide pools and the sky's reflected on them, and then across the Sailor Sea are layers of other islands. So yeah.
And that's something that I'm remembering this from an earlier conversation. I don't know if we had it this year. It's pretty recent, and it was about something to do with layers. And you were saying that this had fascinated you, kind of layers of landscape, I think in the same conversation we were talking about water. But one of the things that I think you're capturing, and it could be intentional or not, is, I think when in my career earlier, or my practice earlier, I did a lot of collage, and I thought about how important layering is as a way of kind of perceiving the world these days, because we're so barraged by things, by information and stuff. And there's something you're capturing in many of your pieces, kind of both the land and the story of the land, and sort of scarification of the land, and anyways, I'm kind of blithering here, but layering being a way to capture something about the 21st century reality of land.
That's a really interesting idea. I could actually see a whole show or book, just layering, and so much potential for spinning off in a lot of different ways with that.
This is beautiful. You have another beautiful monochromatic painting that I don't think you've included in the slideshow, that I'm quite nutty about that big one. I think someone bought it.
This is a big painting. It was a big painting, 6 feet wide. And it was based on a storm that we saw in the northern Sailor Sea when we were out sailing. And all up here is the mainland, with huge mountains that just, these summer rains can rake over the mountains. And off in the distance, the light, the sunlight was shining through these kind of holes in the clouds. And it was just such a stunning sight. So I really wanted to paint it, so that I did that. And it was so many layers. so
And,
so many layers.
photography, had you taken a picture to help start this painting?
Several study photos. Yeah. Yeah.
So photography, memory, the experience of being there,
Yeah.
that contributes to.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, here's another one of the water paintings, with these layers, and like really showing this idea of what you can see through the water, what's lying on top. This one was called Last Leaves. And so these are the leaves floating on the top of the water. And yeah, again, just these kind of experimental techniques to lay down the first layers. And this is, taking these experimental techniques to a real extreme, and like moving the landscape into something very abstract. So this one is called Desert by the Sea. It reminded me of Baja, where I've traveled and sailed a lot. So very kind of unfinished gestural kind of feeling to it, and breaking the pieces up with patterning and using masks. And this is another one called Caribou, sort of done in the same way, just using a very limited palette of dioxazine purple and phthalo green and maybe some ochre, Payne's gray. Yeah. So, and now I spend part of my winter every year in the mountains in the Okanagan, and I've become really entranced with painting snow. So, especially at night, I go on these night walks, and I love what happens when our light spills out on the snow. You get these yellow lights and all the colors in the shadows.
Yeah.
And this is larches. Also, really love painting larches. When we drive here, we go through areas that are burnt. We're having terrible fires in the interior of British Columbia in recent years. This is the hot, dry part of BC. So, just vast forests, just standing charcoal, basically. But driving through there last year, seeing it in the snow, it was so startling. It was just mark making on the snow. And I think this is one of the things that painting helps us to do, is to see more in a more complex way. I mean, it's heartbreaking to see all these dead forests. On the other hand, it's really beautiful. And I really loved making this painting, which again was like very experimental techniques and collage and painting back and scratching in and art making. So that was last year. This is from I'm just talking about the slides as we go through, Kelley. I'm just
That's perfect. That's perfect.
Yeah. Okay. Using experimental techniques. Again, this was a water media course that I gave, and you can see some of the things that have happened here with gauze I've created. I think I laid it down and painted around it, and lots of experimental techniques here. Actually, Kelley, you own this painting, don't you?
This one or one very much like it, because when you showed it to me, you took the rectangle and made it into a square, and that's how I framed it.
Right.
It's right. I think you might have done two of them.
Yeah, it could
have
be
the other one.
Yeah. Anyway, this is like, to me, acrylic, the way I work with acrylic and the way I work with water media are sort of coming together in some of my work, because so much of what we can do with acrylic is like working with water media, especially when you start to work with the inks. And when I teach water media now, I integrate a lot of acrylic media.
Yeah.
So that's kind of fun. That's kind of a first full circle, using watercolor techniques, integrating them with like introducing opacity, the opacity that acrylic gives us. And this is one of my, just pure intuitive pieces, taking the idea of landscape way into abstraction. And I think that might be my last slide. Yeah. So
we didn't spend very much time on still life. So I'm going to suggest that if you want, I mean, we can consider the recording. Maybe what we can do, Alison, is what I did with mine, where you could add a little segment at the end if there's something that you think we didn't get to, or we can do another, like,
let's do another talk. I think
yeah.
still life is almost worth a whole
Okay, I'd love to.
whole
Yeah,
other discussion. We could throw our work together into a slideshow too.
yeah, that would be
To
really
talk,
interesting.
talk
So,
about still life, talk about decorative surfaces, lots of potential. So I think that's a good idea. Stand by.
stand by.
This could be chapter 1.